Security Baseline. Microsoft Windows Server 2008 is the most secure Windows operating system that Microsoft has ever introduced, but that said, simply throwing Windows 2008 onto your network won't offer you a lot of the protection that you really need. Now, there's a lot more to Windows security than simply leaving the firewall on. Now, in this video, we'll be talking about creating a security baseline for your Windows network, and in other videos, we'll discuss security-specific roles like DNS, IIS, DHCP, and things like that. So firstly, we're going to talk about two security baseline environments that you can consider, which are the Enterprise Client and the Specialized Security Limited functionality, both of which are now managed through group policy objects rather than a security template like it was back in Windows Server 2003. Microsoft have introduced a GPO accelerator tool, which we can use to create both the Enterprise Client and Specialized Security Limited functionality policies that we can use to enforce this tight security over our servers. Now, on my desktop here, I've downloaded this GPO accelerator tool, which I might add is currently in beta, but I'd expect that it will be made final shortly, so let's use this as our baseline. I should preface that, of course, with a warning that since this is beta software, I wouldn't recommend that you deploy this in a production environment. Instead, deploy it in your lab, use it to build the policies that you want to have in production, and then just copy those policies over to your production network. So we'll run this file by double-clicking on it. And as you'd expect, this will start up a wizard here, so we'll click Next. Now we'll accept the terms in the license agreement. We'll click Next again. Now we could change the default installation path if we like. I'll leave it as it is. We'll click Next, and then we'll click Install. Now, as this is a pretty small installation, it shouldn't take too long. In fact, there you go. It's already done, so we'll click Finish. All right, now we'll go and click on Start, All Programs. We'll select GPO Accelerator, and then we'll launch the GPO Accelerator command line. Now, if we scroll up amongst all of this output here, on the left-hand side, you can see a whole bunch of switches that we can use when we run the GPO Accelerator script. Now, some of these are going to be used for client machines like Windows Vista. Others will not only create the group policy objects that we want, but also the OU structure. And whilst that might sound okay and it's not really a problem for a lab creating a whole OU structure, but in your lab, you probably already have an OU structure, and certainly in production you will. So what we'll do here is just to create all of the group policy objects and leave everything else. So we'll need to run two commands here. The first one will be to run the GPO accelerator with the / Windows Server Security Guide switch, and then we'll follow that up with the Enterprise switch, and we'll hit Enter. And we're asked, are we sure we want to go and create these? Yes, of course we're sure. All right, it's done, so we'll click on OK. And we're told here that these GPOs will need to be linked to the appropriate OUs to take effect. So we'll get rid of this message and we'll run our second command, which is basically the same as the first, except we'll delete the Enterprise switch and we'll replace that with the SSLF switch, and we'll hit Enter. And of course, we'll click Yes to create these. And again, in a few moments, it'll be done. So we'll click on OK. And again, we will be reminded these GPOs will need to be linked to the appropriate OUs to take effect. Now, before we take any closer look at these policies we've just installed, we'll move on. We'll come back to them, since these policies will need to be linked to our OUs, which at this stage we haven't talked about. So let's go and do that now. On a default installation of Active Directory, everything that we have or create will stem from the domain root. At the domain root, we'll be applying the domain policy, and this policy will be a pretty generic policy which will affect every single user, computer, and server in the entire domain. Now, obviously, since it affects everything, this policy generally doesn't get too specific in what it secures, but it does serve to cover things like password policies, which you'll most likely want to use to force strong passwords across everything in your entire domain. Now, on a default installation of Active Directory, we really only have two locations where our servers will be placed. They'll either be placed in the domain controller's OU or the computer's OU. Now, obviously, if the server that you're installing is going to be a domain controller, it'll be placed in the domain controller's OU, and all domain controllers will be governed by another policy called the domain controller's policy. This policy will enforce security settings that are specific only to domain controllers, and only domain controllers will be applying this policy. Now, next we have the computer's container, and since this really is a big dumb default container and really nothing more, we can't assign a policy directly to it. Now, in an environment where we care about security, only the domain policy will be applying to this container, and as such, it's inefficient for our needs. So instead, we're going to create a new OU called member servers, where we're able to assign either an enterprise client or specialized security limited functionality policies to this OU. Now, this means that any member server we create and place into this OU will then be secured by not only the domain policy, which covers every computer in the domain, but also by a more granular and hopefully more restrictive policy that's been assigned directly here at this OU. Now, inside our member servers OU, we'll then create additional child OUs that will be used to contain our member servers based on what role they perform. These child OUs will also be able to have another policy enforced upon them that's specific to securing the type of role that the server performs. This means that we now have a minimum of 4 policies that will be applied in our network. We have one at the domain, one at the domain controller's OU, another in the member servers OU, and finally one at each role-based OU. Now, one thing that this OU doesn't factor in at this stage is user and client computer policies, and that's something that's out of scope for these Windows security videos, but it is something that we will discuss in other group policy videos later on. So let's go and take a quick look at how this structure would look in Active Directory. Now, to save time, I've already gone ahead and built the basis of the OU structure we've just talked about here on my domain controller. So we'll go and click on Start, we'll go to Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. And now we'll expand our domain here. And here you can see we do have a top-level OU called Member Servers. And in case you weren't aware, when we create OUs in Active Directory on Windows 2008, the default is to protect the OU from accidental deletion. So if we try and right-click on this and we'll choose Delete, and we'll say, yeah, well, sure, we want to delete this, we're told that we either don't have sufficient privileges to delete this OU, or it's been protected from accidental deletion. Well, actually, in my case, since I'm logged on using the administrator's account, I do have the permissions required to delete this OU. But to do so, we'll go up to our View menu and we'll choose to turn on the advanced features. And now we'll go and right-click on our Member Servers OU again, and we'll choose Properties. Then we'll go to the Object tab. And if we uncheck this box here, we're now able to delete the OU. All right, well, let's turn off advanced features for now, and we'll go back and expand our member servers OU. And in here you can see I've placed a bunch of other OUs where we'll be placing our member servers based on the role that they perform. So we have an OU for our DHCP servers, another for our DNS servers, file servers, print servers, and so forth. Now, this is useful since it allows us to have an overall policy deployed at the member servers OU and a more granular policy that's been specifically tuned for the role that these servers will play, since it's likely that we'll want specific policies and settings for, say, a DHCP server, and those settings will be different to what we'll have on a print server, for example. So this sort of baseline OU structure allows us to be very specific with our security settings. Now, the only time that this sort of structure might really cause you a concern is where you have multiple roles on the same server. So, for example, let's say that we have a file server that's also a print server. Which OU do you put it in? Now, you might have policies you want to deploy for the print server that severely restrict the file serving capabilities so much that it causes problems. So in these situations, you'll be up for somewhat more testing to ensure that things are working as you intend them to be. And you might even find that you have to relax the security somewhat to ensure that both roles are able to function correctly. Now, the other option, and probably a better one in this situation, is to create a file and print servers OU and then place servers that hold both those roles in that OU and set up a specific policy for those servers only. That way, if you do have other file and print servers that only hold those single roles by themselves, they can still be placed inside these relevant OUs with full security. Alright, now that we have a good idea of how to structure our OUs, let's take a look at how group policies are applied to our servers. The first policy that will be applied to any users, computers, or servers is that of the local security policy. On a standalone computer that isn't part of a domain, this will be the only policy that's applied to the machine, but in a domain, it's just the first one that's applied. The second policy that will be applied is the site policy, which, as the name suggests, is set at the site level. The third policy that will be applied is the domain policy, which covers every single user, computer, or server in the domain. The fourth policy that will be applied is the parent OU policy, which would be the member servers OU, which should provide a good, strong, generic baseline policy for all servers inside that OU. And the fifth and final policy that will be applied is the child OU policy, which we'll use to configure very specific security settings for each of the server roles that we need to secure. So, as you look through the way in which group policies are applied, you can, in all honesty, configure them in one of two ways. You could configure very restrictive lockdown type policies at the site and domain levels and then override those settings for each role that you want to deploy. Or you could have slightly more relaxed security policies at the site and domain levels and then configure very strict policies for each role that you want to deploy. Either way, both of these strategies will work because the default behavior of group policy is to override each policy as it's being applied with that of the new one. So, for argument's sake, let's say at the domain level, we had a policy to disable a specific service from running on our server, but at the parent OU, it doesn't even have this setting configured at all. But moving on to the child OU, it says, no, turn that service on, please, we want it to run. So, what then happens? Well, the service will run, but only on that server that's applying the policy, since the child OU policy setting will override any inherited policies from above. Every other server in the domain will not be running that service. Now, this sort of policy inheritance can be overridden or enforced as well, depending on how you'd like it to be configured. But although you can enforce or override policy inheritance, it's not a thing that we recommend, since it can make troubleshooting group policy a real pain later on. So let's go and take a closer look at these policies. So we'll click on Start, we'll go to Administrative Tools, and we'll launch Group Policy Management. Now if we go and expand our forest on the left here, you can see the domains and the sites container where we can assign policies directly at the domain level and at the site level. Now if we expand domains, and then our domain, winstructorlab.com, in here you can see we have the default domain policy, as well as our domain controllers and member servers OUs. So let's expand both of these out as well. Now here you'll note that the domain controllers OU are applying the default domain controller policy, but at this stage our member servers are not applying anything with the exception of the default domain policy. And if we select our member servers OU, and on the right hand side we'll select Group Policy Inheritance tab, and here you can see that our member servers OU is applying our default domain policy. However, if we right-click on our member servers OU, for example, we can choose to block inheritance, but if we do this, then that'll mean that all of the child OUs as well will no longer inherit the default domain policy. And when you have a lot of OUs nested inside of each other, it does make it more difficult to manage what policies are being applied overall. Now, earlier in this video, we installed the GPO Accelerator tool, which also installed a whole bunch of enterprise client and specialized security limited functionality group policy objects. So if we come over here to the left and expand group policy objects, and we'll move this slider bar over a bit so we can see what we've got, you'll see a whole bunch of new policies here in this list. So let's talk about the differences between these two types of policies first. The enterprise client policies are designed for the majority of companies that still require that their services are usable and highly available, but also need to have them as secure as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of companies stick with the default installations of servers. They apply a server role such as DNS and then leave it at that. And they have, obviously, a false sense of security. By applying these enterprise client policies, you can still have all of that functionality, but with much better security. Now, on the other hand, our specialized security limited functionality policies are designed for highly secure environments where security is the number one priority and functionality is secondary. Hence the name, specialized security limited functionality. Security is so important in some companies that if it makes it hard for you to do your job, then tough luck. Security always comes first. So you'll probably find that some of these policies will be so super restrictive, and in the majority of cases, you'll be using the enterprise client policies instead, which are still very secure, but not at the risk of crippling your ability to still use the server effectively. So let's select one of these, let's say the DNS policy. And in the right-hand side, we'll click on the Settings tab. And in here, we're able to drill down through these hyperlinks to determine which policies are being used. Now, anything that has the word show here means that there are policies that have been configured. So in our DNS server policy here, we can see that something is under security settings. So if we click on show, we can see that the system services and the Windows firewall and also the administrative templates all have some sort of settings that have been modified. So if we click on show next to system services here, we're able to see a whole bunch of services that aren't required for DNS functionality. So we can see that a lot of these are set to disabled, some of them are set to automatic, and this is really useful because if we're only deploying the DNS role on a member server, then we can use this as our baseline to lock this server down nice and tight and reduce the attack surface of the server by disabling anything that we don't need. So let's select the next one here, the Windows firewall. We'll click on the show hyperlink here. And we've got a few sub options. So let's select another one of these, say inbound rules. And again, if we scroll down, you'll notice that again, so much of the configuration's been already done for us. And we can, of course, modify this to suit our own needs if we like, or simply apply it as it is to our DNS servers. Now, what makes these policies great for us administrators is that manually going through and setting all of this up ourselves will take so much time that it's not even funny. And even then, a lot of us are bound to miss something. So we're able to use this policy to build upon and either tighten these even further if we like, or relax the security somewhat to suit our own requirements. So to apply these policies to one of our member servers, let's go up and expand our member servers OU, which I've already done. And we'll right click on one of them. We're going to use our DNS server here since we've been talking about it. So we'll right click and we'll choose to link an existing group policy object. Now from the list here, we're able to locate the GPO that we want to link. And of course, in this instance, it'll be the Enterprise Client DNS Servers policy. So we'll highlight that and we'll click on OK. And now if we're going to expand our DNS OU, you can see that this policy is linked here and all of those settings that are contained in this Enterprise Client DNS Service policy will be enforced on any DNS server that we create inside this OU. So in this video, we've talked about creating a security baseline for the servers in your domain. Now, it's important that you take the time to secure your servers for obvious reasons, and employing an OU and group policy structure like the one we've talked about is not only recommended, but it's also going to make supporting and extending your network easier, as this type of structure is really easy to manage.